Hello! I hope you all are well and that the spring semester and its very strangeness is going well for you. Please remember that if you need anything or you want to talk with me, you can send me an email. I'm happy to meet virtually or be in conversation over email, and we can figure out how to make things work for you if there's any problems you're encountering. The topic for this week is atonement theologies. I actually put this topic here because one of the central figures we talk about in atonement theology is a man by the name of Anselm of Canterbury, who lived right around 1000. So it fits in terms of our chronology. But I should say that this is one of those topics where we'll talk about Anselm, but then we're going to talk about a lot of other folks both before and after him. So this makes sense in my head because Anselm fits in our chronology, but we're going to be talking about a lot of people through time. And even before we get to atonement theology, oh, and if you're wondering, what's atonement theology? This is the understanding of why Jesus died. How did Jesus' death affect humanity? The people in the Christian tradition have had to think through this. As we'll see, there's no one answer. So we'll get to the atonement theologies. But first, I'm going to do a little bit of history, focusing on developments in the Western Church and then developments between the Western and the Eastern churches. So we're just going to say a little bit here about church and state, particularly again in the West. And when I say the West, I mean those churches that are part of the Latin-speaking world that become the Catholic Church and then eventually the Protestant churches. And here we have a very famous picture. This is the Vatican in Rome. And to give you just a thesis here, what we're talking about for the next couple of slides is how Rome became a power center, both politically and spiritually, and then how the relationship between Rome and the papacy is the offices surrounding the Pope, I mean the Pope in his offices, how that interacted with other powers, particularly political powers in the Western countries. All right, so the first thing we have to do is talk a little bit about the rise of what we call papal power, or this idea of a pope. Now, we've talked a little bit about bishops, that there were spiritual leaders in various places who kind of were in charge of their territory. So the Bishop of Alexandria, the Bishop of, for that matter, Rome, the Bishop of Constantinople, someone who was in charge of that area. What we see happen, though, in the West, in the Western Roman Empire, is the emergence of the Bishop of Rome as the primate, meaning the bishop with the primary power, the one who's in charge. So today in the Catholic Church, Catholics acknowledge the authority of the Pope above all other bishops. Well, that didn't just happen. It wasn't necessarily there from the beginning. It's a development in the Western Church, and turns out a pretty important one. So two figures here that were important in the emergence of the Pope as the first among bishops, and then the bishop with really the most power in the Western Church. The first one I want to talk about is Leo I, who lived from 440 to he was the Bishop of Rome, or the Pope, between 440 and 461. So we are after Augustine. And he made a theological argument about why the Bishop of Rome should be superior to all other bishops. And he did it based upon the Apostle Peter. Peter historically was said to be the first bishop of Rome. And Leo made the argument that in the book of Matthew, the New Testament book of Matthew, Jesus gave Peter special power. And the key verse comes in Matthew 16. Peter Jesus had asked the disciples, "Who do you say that I am?" And Peter says, "You are the Messiah." And then Jesus says to Peter, "On this rock I will build my church. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven." Now, it's important to know here that rock is a name for Peter. So Peter the Rock, not like The Rock, the movie star, but Peter is the Rock. Was one of Peter's names. And so what Leo said is that Jesus is saying he's building the church on Peter and Peter's authority, and that Peter and then the successors to Peter will be able to bind on earth and loose on earth, meaning that they will be the final authority on spiritual questions on earth, always subservient to God, of course, but on earth, the final authorities. And so the idea here, according to Leo, is that because Peter was the first bishop of Rome, Peter's authority goes from bishop to bishop to bishop, meaning from bishop of Rome to bishop of Rome to bishop of Rome. Leo's position was not accepted by the East. It's never going to be accepted by the East. They're never going to think that the Bishop of Rome is the primary bishop. But it was an argument that Leo makes. Another really important pope in terms of gaining this kind of power was Gregory I, who was pope between 590 and 604. And part of what made Gregory really strong was simply the dissolution of the Western Roman Empire. There was a power vacuum. There was nobody really in charge. And the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, became in many ways the last authority standing in the West. So Gregory did things like negotiate with the Lombards, one of these groups of people who were coming in and attacking Rome. He helps to organize the city and distribute food. He just fulfills fills a power vacuum that was happening. So he gets power because there's power to be taken. He called the papacy servants of the servants of God, which makes it sound maybe like you're the lowest person on the totem pole, but not really. What he meant there was that the Bishop of Rome was the person who was supposed to be caring for, right, the father of all of the other bishops and then Christians. So Leo made a really clear theological argument. Gregory was sort of able to enact that argument in real life. And what you have is the development of the Pope as the head of the church in the West. Something else that happened then was a relationship or growing relationship between political leaders in the West and the Pope. And one of the first places we see this was in the development of what we call the Holy Roman Empire. Now, you might be thinking, wait, I thought the Roman Empire just fell. Yes, it did, in the West. But starting with a man named Charlemagne, we have the development of something called the Holy Roman Empire, which goes basically from Germany into France, to the upper reaches of Italy. I had a college professor once who said that the Holy Roman Empire was kind of like the Great Smoky Mountains, which weren't great, smoky, or mountains. The Holy Roman Empire was not holy, wasn't Roman, and wasn't an empire. But nevertheless, it was a political body that exercised great influence in Europe for about 1,000 years. There's a Holy Roman Empire, give or take. And what's important here is that the emperors of the Holy Roman Empire and the Pope help each other and give each other a little credibility. So Pope Zachary, I love that there was a pope named Pope Zachary. Sounds like the Pope was Saved by the Bell. Nevertheless, Pope Zachary in the mid-8th century, um, took sides in a fight among a dynasty called the Carolingians, who Charlemagne was a Carolingian. He's going to come out of this lineage. And what the Carolingians did is they were fighting against a king, and they won, and they wanted to put their predecessor kings, the ones they had vanquished, into exile. And Gregory said, sure, that's legitimate to do. He gave them kind of the stamp of approval of the church. And then the Carolingians turned around and became, while they were in power, political protectors of the Pope and gave the Pope land in Italy, which meant that the Pope now was both a spiritual authority and an actual political authority. This is still true. The Vatican is controlled today by the Pope, but it's a very small bit of land. This was a much larger piece of land that the Pope controlled in Italy. So there was this mutual relationship between the Pope and some political leaders. That relationship, though, did also have tensions over time. It was sometimes hard for popes and monarchs to decide whose power was whose. Where did spiritual power begin and end, and where did political power begin and end? And one of the most famous episodes in this kind of tension-filled relationship came about 200 years after Pope Zachary, no, 300 years later, math is hard, with a pope named Gregory the Seventh. He was a reforming pope. He wanted to tackle significant issues in the church. Particularly, he wanted to tackle something called lay investiture and simony. So the simony is simply the selling of clerical offices. So you can buy a bishop's seat if you have enough money. As you might suspect, that meant that the people who became bishops weren't necessarily the most spiritual people, but were the people who could buy the seat. And if you're wondering, like, why would you want to buy a bishop's seat? Oftentimes these came with land, and they were a source of wealth. So people would buy them so that they could have them. Getting rid of simony went with another one of Gregory's reforms, which was instituting and really pressing clerical celibacy. Today, as you probably know, Catholic clerics, for the most part, can't be married. That's just the expectation. And some people assume that it's always been that way, but that's not the case. There hasn't always been a clear rule about whether clerics could be married or not. In fact, even today in the Catholic Church, there are a few married priests, men who were priests usually in the Episcopal tradition, who become Catholic and are allowed to be priests and are also allowed to keep their families. So it's not a dogmatic position in the sense that there's absolutely no way to be a priest and to have a family. It's a practice of the Catholic Church. And one of the reasons that Gregory was really invested in it was because if priests couldn't have children, they couldn't have heirs, meaning you couldn't pass your bishop's seat or your role as the abbot or the head of a monastery to your child, which you could see people might be tempted to do. If I bought a bishop's seat, I might want to pass that on and keep it in the family, as kings do. And so clerical celibacy was, among other things, a way to try to make sure that you weren't creating dynasties of priests. So those two things went together. The other thing that was a source of frustration for Gregory was the practice of what was called lay investiture. So lay here means people who are not priests, people who are not ordained. And what would happen in lay investiture is that a noble person, so this wasn't just any old, Jim person off the street or Bob, right? But this is a noble, a king or a lord, would invest the cleric with the symbols of power. So if someone became a bishop, the local lord would invest that person with the symbols of their power, suggesting that it was the noble lay person who was giving the cleric their role, right? Very clearly saying that the lay person the noble is over the cleric. Gregory did not like this. He did not think that should be the relationship, that the cleric should have some greater separation from the oversight of local political leaders. This became a fight between a king, our Holy Roman Empire emperor named Henry IV. Henry IV didn't like this. He liked lay investiture. So he decided to invest 3 candidates in the Pope's jurisdiction. So basically walking into the Pope's backyard and being like, oh, I'm going to give you your symbol of power, and you, and, kind of in your face, Pope. Gregory then excommunicated Henry, which means in Catholic doctrine at that time that Henry is going to hell. And he said that people were not committed. Gregory said that people didn't have to be committed to a king who was out of communion. So he was basically inviting people to rebel. There was this very historic reconciliation between Henry and Gregory. And what the church and the state eventually came to was the Concordant of Worms, which means that the emperor would not appoint bishops. That would be the role of the church. But that they would be present at elections and would receive homage if the bishop was part of the feudal chain. So insofar as the bishop was a political leader, that bishop would give some homage to the local lord, but the church was responsible for choosing the leader. So that wasn't going to be something just done by the local nobility deciding who they wanted to be bishops. So we're beginning to see some distinction between this is the role of political power, this is the role of spiritual power in the West. The other thing I want to talk about simply is that the church splits East and West in the Middle Ages. In 1054, the Western churches and the Eastern churches, so those Latin-speaking churches and the Greek-speaking churches, mutually excommunicate each other. And there had been lots of issues. There had been some bad relationships for a long time. Certainly simply the language barrier. They operated in different languages. They tended to have different debates had become an issue. The Filioque controversy, we talked about that with the Creed when the Western Church inserted the phrase "and the Son" into the Nicene Creed to talk about the procession of the Holy Spirit from the Father and the Son. The Western Church just did that, and that made the East really mad. Clerical celibacy. The East didn't agree with that. They didn't think that it was necessary for all clerics to be celibate. And then finally, claims about papal primacy. The Eastern Church just never agreed that the Bishop of Rome was somehow superior to other bishops. All of these things came together with also some difficult personalities in 1054, and the two groups excommunicated each other. Some Orthodox thinkers recently have noticed that one of the things that Pope Francis often does when he's talking to or about the Orthodox churches is that the Pope Francis will simply refer to himself as the Bishop of Rome and not refer to himself in those contexts as the Pope, as sort of an acknowledgement that the Orthodox churches do not consider him to be the Pope, but do consider him to be the Bishop of Rome, who is an important bishop, but simply one among many. Finally, then, we're basically done now talking about the Orthodox churches, that wing of churches from the East. They are still vital churches, they're still important, but we're going to move our class to focusing on the Western churches. So just a couple more things to say about the Orthodox churches. Overall, political leaders have more power in the Eastern churches than in the Western churches. And that's simply because that Roman Empire that split West and East, right? The West goes away. The Eastern part of the Roman Empire becomes called the Byzantine Empire, and it lasts for another 1,000 years. It lasts till almost 1500. So there's just more political control where the Orthodox churches are. Those emperors will call councils and they'll announce outcomes and take a lot of, they might say stewardship, other people would say control of church issues. There's no papal primacy. Some people claim that the Eastern churches are more mystical or sensuous, meaning they're more interested in how we receive information through our senses, through smells and sights and sounds. Maybe other people are a little less comfortable with that kind of a distinction. Probably the biggest difference that it's very, very clear that exists between the Orthodox and the Catholic churches are those two traditions, other than papal primacy, is again that the Eastern churches don't have a doctrine of original guilt. So they don't then have a doctrine of predestination. There's just parts of theology that the Western church is going to talk about that the Eastern Church just never does. It does not think um, is biblical. It doesn't think is valid. So the theological conversation, insofar as it turns on those two issues, will look different East and West, even though they do share a lot in common, including the major creeds, the filioque notwithstanding.